Welcome to the Critical Media Studies Podcast. We're your hosts, Mike Rapici
and Barry Falk.
Hello, Michael. How are you doing this evening?
Barry, I'm doing very well. How are you?
We got our forced hellos out of the way, and now we're ready
Done.
to have a nice conversation. And in
No,
fact,
you know what? Hold on. In all fairness,
okay, well,
I'm good. I'm looking forward to this. As I said, I got some gummy bears here. This wasn't a lie.
so this is not phatic talk. This is not meaningless conversation. This is an accurate, authentic, in keeping with what we're going to be talking about. You gave me your authentic feelings, and I'm giving you my authentic feelings, right?
And that's what matters.
Not a superimposed by the image feeling.
No,
we're drawing on our own emotions,
the real.
The real. We got the real here. Nothing like the real. Okay, what are we talking about? We're going to be talking about today a very interesting sort of retrospective piece from I think this is an Australian online cultural zine or magazine journal called The Conversation. And the author is a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Western Australia. His name is Andrew Milne. And then what we're going to be doing is talking about his very interesting, recently published online piece, Tourists in Our Own Reality, Susan Sontag's Photography at 50. And before we go any further, we should say that we're talking about Susan Sontag, the writer, philosopher, essayist, the writer and novelist, who I can't remember exactly when she passed away, but I think it's been about 15, 20 years. She was a major figure on the American literary scene in the 60s, 70s, up into her death, really. But her heyday, I suppose, was the 60s and 70s. And we're going to be talking about a specific book that's now 50 years old. The book is called On Photography. It was published in 1977. And there's a little bit of history, microhistory or historical connection between Susan Sontag and the On Photography book with this that we can modestly point to as part of our own podcast, because we talked about On Plato's Cave, the opening essay in Susan Sontag's On Photography book. We talked about that in episode, did I write it down? Yes.
37.
37. And now that we're approaching our 65th episode, which I think is this episode, we're going to be returning to Sontag. And I guess one more thing, and then please, I guess we'll get started, but I'll say two things quickly. And then if you want to add something to the Sontag intro and bumper, please do. And if not, we'll just proceed apace. But the first thing to say is, why are we revisiting it? Well, last time we talked about Susan Sontag, even though we were talking about an essay that came from the book that we'll be discussing, we were having an analog, we were doing our own little cool, I think, history of analog reconsidered from the digital age moment. And we were thinking about digital photography. We were thinking about photography. We were thinking about photography and film. We were also talking about Andre Bazin and his no less philosophical ruminations on the image and the photograph that were part of his understanding, his own idiosyncratic casting of film history. But we were mostly talking about, I think, Michael, this is right, we were mostly talking about Sontag within the Platonic frame, what does Plato think about an image, and how is the photograph like Plato's cave and things like that. And we were thinking about the photography as its own medium with its own history. And I'm sure, being the Critical Media Studies podcast, we must have mentioned something about the current media landscape, but I don't think we talked about it very much at all. And so one of the reasons we're attracted to this essay is that Andrew Milne will allow us an opportunity, because he already does this, He is very much considering the On Photography book in light of our current always online culture. So we thought this would be an opportunity to weigh in on Sontag from a different perspective. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think very much so. As I recall, the conversation we had around Sontag last time was really focused on her essay and how that
Yeah,
essay and how that
exactly.
essay and what
Yeah,
and how does she see photography? How are we
right.
encouraged to see
I remember
photography?
we talked a lot about the photographer,
Yes.
like, what, as she does in that essay, like she kind of characterizes the psychology of the individual photographer. And
Hmm.
there was a lot of that in that essay. And I think that was maybe the fulcrum or the focus of one of the foci of our.
Yeah, I believe so. I think that tonight the goal is more to talk about how we understand her arguments in light of a fully digital, fully connected,
Right,
networked world,
right, right.
which is a different
Absolutely.
discussion. I mean, I think there's going to probably be some overlap. So I would say that, if you want to go back and listen to the other episode, it might provide, a little, what's the word I'm looking for?
Well, it's a different perspective, a fuller perspective, but it's going to be a different perspective for
That's it.
sure.
I think it's what I'm trying to say is like it's the other side of the coin. I
Yes.
think is
Yeah.
maybe a way of saying
Yeah.
it. But I think it would be. I think that hopefully tonight we can do justice to the content. So
All right. Well, let's proceed through the Milne essay, shall we?
we shall.
The first passage that I want Dr. Rapici to comment on, and I will help, not that he needs it, is this passage from near the beginning of the essay. Uh, Sontag claimed that we photograph most when we feel most insecure, particularly when we are in an unfamiliar place. So we're going to begin with the general argument, or where Milne sort of reprises or tries to summarize the basic claim about the psychology. Let me start that sentence again. Or Milne is trying to summarize and paraphrase the psychology of the photograph, or the psychology that our contemporary psychology, insofar as we live with photographic images and that we're surrounded by photographic images.
Hmm.
And Sontag feels there's a kind of psychic slash spiritual cost that's exacted by living with the photograph, or living primarily through the mediation of the photographic image. And so now I think I'm ready to read the quote. Okay. Sontag claimed first that we photograph most when we feel most insecure, particularly when we are in an unfamiliar place where we don't know how to react or what is expected of us. Taking a photograph, here's the key sentence, taking a photograph becomes a way of attenuating, of weakening the otherness of a place and holding it at a distance. Comments?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple ways of approaching this, and I'm looking at this through Sontag's claim that when you take a photograph, you're not, in fact, capturing reality, that photograph is a composition unto itself,
Mhm.
and that it is not, that it is something different. It is not the
Mhm.
same thing that you were photographing, in terms of suddenly a facsimile that is the same. It
So
is
it isn't a transparent mediation. It is a transformation of reality,
that's a
or our
great
attitude to reality through the
transformation.
media. Yeah.
Yes. And so if I think about it in that way, taking a photograph becomes a way of attenuating the otherness of a place, holding it a distance. He goes down a little further, and he makes the claim, just having taken a photograph, we think of
Mhm.
its subject as our captive,
Captive, right,
right?
right.
It's there. And so to me, this process of a transformation from a real moment to a version of that moment on film or pixelated or however,
Right.
it really speaks to a weird sort of I almost want to say like a power struggle in the sense of by being able to say, I'm framing this thing which is
Yeah.
bigger and foreign and scary, but I'm able to assert a measure of agency here. In this photograph, I have a measure of control, and that control frames it in a way that I can then stop time. I can
Yeah.
reflect
Yeah.
on it.
Yeah.
I can
Yeah.
hold this moment captive. And in doing so, I'm able to then gain an understanding. I'm able to sort of flip the dynamic.
And gain the upper hand. I mean, I think
Yes.
what you point out brilliantly, and I'm glad you went there. I think it's the most important thing to say. This is a way of exerting control over the situation, of gaining the upper hand. And what she thinks of our that we are I don't know, trying to control, manipulate, manage reality when we take a photograph. So it's all about a power dynamic. That was the word you used a couple
Right.
minutes ago.
Right.
That there's a kind of power dynamic going on. That's the core of her argument. It's also kind of wish fulfillment. We want to be in control, and it's even if we're not in control of reality, the photograph helps us delude ourselves or fool ourselves that we are in control of the
And
situation.
I think that's an aspect of all this that I hope we are able to get back to because, there's a really interesting division between, I made the comment earlier, right, about the real, right? That the photograph in a way is a false real,
Yeah, or
right?
that's real.
It's like, if I take a picture of my dog, that's not my dog. It's a photograph. It's staged. I've taken it from this angle. I've done these things. So it's a different thing that masquerades and placates us in a way. It's enough. It's close enough. We buy into the myth that this thing, which is a photograph, is an acceptable substitute for the thing that it's supposed to represent or be. And so there's this, I don't want to say it's a delusion necessarily, but it's sort of
But it's a fantasy of power.
that's a
How
good
about
word.
that? Right? Right.
It's a
There's a phantasmic element to it. You were reminding me, and I don't want to go too far in this because my memory is hazy, but I seem to remember one of the things that we ended up talking about when we were pairing in when we were doing episodes on Sontag and Andre Bazin, kind of in tandem, in close relation to each other. I think one of the things that we notice is that actually Bazin is very insistent on the opposite argument, that in a way, the photograph is the damn real. That's what, we have these other fantastic relations or phantasmic psychological relations to the image, but when viewed in the history of art, the photograph is the real. Now, that may or may not be the case with
yeah, he
Sondheim.
my am I he was juxtaposing it with painting though.
Yeah, yeah, right. So
Yes.
compared to painting,
Hmm.
the thing about photography is that it is finally, for the first time in human history, it's the real.
Yeah. And this
Yeah,
and so these sort of thin slices of perception or the stories that we tell ourselves and how we choose to, I mean,
yeah,
the fact that we're even having the discussion like this, I think is gives credence to the argument that what we're really doing from this is almost unfair to say it this way. It's a shell game of perception.
yeah. But I didn't want to drop the Bazin bomb.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say, interestingly enough, he has this other argument about the ontological status. That's the title of the chapter, about the ontological status of the photograph. But what's preeminent in what we're talking about tonight in Sontag, what's preeminent in Sontag's perspective of the photography is that there is a phantasmic relation over and above the question, bracketing off the question of, is the photograph real, which preoccupies Bazin. Sontag, in a way, puts that question aside and focuses on the fantastic psychological relationship that we have with life and with the photograph, so that the photograph literally helps us mediate and maybe even a better word, it's a medial transaction, right? Or maybe we need that phrase. It's a media that allows us to transact with life or to imagine that we are. So there's more of this emphasis on the fantastic element of photographs. I
Yeah,
don't know.
no, I
Is
think
that
that's right.
right?
But what and where where this gets fascinating is when you think about the as we started this discussion, I was initially thinking about like, okay, well, the picture on my phone, right? Or the picture that I've taken and I store on my computer.
Mhm.
But this becomes a really interesting discussion. And I don't really want to linger here for too long, but I think that it's still germane to the argument we're sort of playing with now. This idea about the public image and then these sort of fantastic realities that we
Yes,
are telling
absolutely.
ourselves, but also the ones that were sold as reality. And I think this is part of
Indeed.
the
Indeed.
part of the complication here is that we are accustomed to think of the image and we're encouraged to think of the image as the real. And
And go ahead. Yeah,
no, I was gonna say,
please.
and there's a tremendous amount of there's the thing that's interesting is if we think about this statement
Hmm.
about taking pictures when we're insecure and we're unfamiliar
Hmm.
places, when we are at a disadvantage,
Hmm.
right? This becomes a weird sort of psychological pep talk. The
Indeed.
power is imagined. But
Indeed.
when you
Indeed.
think about
Exactly.
the published image, and you can think about this as propaganda in so many different ways, perhaps, but that power shifts from being an imagined
Hmm.
thing to something very, very real.
Absolutely. And, to bring up Bazan for perhaps it would be for the best if it's the last time in this episode, but um, Bazan is so interested in the philosophical status or the ontological status of the issue that in a way he's asking questions that set him apart, that kind of place him within the philosophical milieu of the French existentialism of the 40s and 50s. Sontag is very much of her 60s, 70s moment, i.e., she's really interested in the social effects of photography, like you're talking about. And
Right.
so she's more in conversation with, say, Guy Debord and his idea of the society of the spectacle of a social order that's mediated by images that can be false, right? That have
Hmm.
no relation to reality, but people transact with them, interact with them as if they are the true reality. So theories of Sontag is very much of her 60s, 70s moment in that she is thinking about the political consequences of a society that lives through the mediation of the photograph. And more than that question doesn't really operate or engage Bazan very much, but it's at the core of what Sontag is doing. How about I go to passage two?
Indeed.
We're still in the same groove thing, actually, in this next passage. What we see in the photograph is mediated. Oh, is she shifting here to? Well, let me read the passage. I think I marked this initially because I think this was some place where Milne, and if not Milne, maybe we'll take it, where the observation kind of shifts into uh, an observation about the present time. Let me
Hmm.
read it. What we see is mediated by technology. When we look through the eyes of the camera, everything is revealed as a possible photograph. This has an astonishing effect. People and experiences appear discrete, the sort of thing suitable for collection in the miscellany of memory. Okay, let me just say one brief thing here before I open it up for your comment, Michael. I marked this passage, and the internet is not mentioned as I read it aloud.
Hmm.
Uh, the internet is not mentioned by Mill, but when I read this passage, I was thinking we could substitute in every one of the sentences here, we could substitute the internet for photography and it would work. So that here's what I was doing sort of internally, and I'd like to see if you agree with this, or if you would want to complicate this. I read this paragraph and I thought this short paragraph and I thought, oh my God, what Milne says Sontag says about the 70s world of living with the photographic image, um, with photographic images in newspapers and being surrounded by them, or images that are projected on a TV screen, is even more true of the internet, even more true of social media. Um, so, so that one of the sentences I thought of, what we see is mediated by technology. Yeah, that's the internet. And the internet, in the same way, is a mediation that has to do with the processing and turning of the world into an image.
I think, yes, I think that's right. I think that if we look at when she says what we see is mediated by technology, her intent there, or his intent there, in talking about Sontag, is that the camera functions as a technology, and that technology has a fundamental impact on how we see things. And the effects of the technology that Milne is talking about, again, is a power dynamic, right? That we
Right,
are,
right, right.
everything is now a potential target. It is a potential subject for a photograph. But more than that,
And everything could
everything,
be posted on Instagram, possibly.
but more than that,
Uh-huh.
everything can also be removed from its particular context and
Contact.
therefore become a part of a deliberate
Right,
composition.
right, right.
And so this makes sense in terms of the discussion we just had a few minutes ago, right? Like this is the composition of an alternate version of something real.
Mhm, mhm,
But when you look about the internet and in terms of all of the ways that we see the world through the lens of, through the screen, essentially,
mhm.
right? We are able to decontextualize, recontextualize. The meaning of things is suddenly very slippery. So this idea of something being authentic in terms of a lived experience
Right.
is now that much farther, that much further in the rearview mirror. And this is something that I think he gets into quite a bit with this discussion in terms of some of the things that we still
He
want to
is a
talk about here.
mill. He is a mill. Gets into this more. Is that right?
Yes,
He
yes,
is a
yes,
mill.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. Well, in terms of like looking at how Sontag, how we can see these things through Sontag, but I think this is very much a place where we can, as you had said correctly, we can look at the camera and this technology. We could substitute the internet for it, and it makes the point, I think, that much more clear because it can be hard to look at. Again, I'm using my dog. It's like, well, that's a picture of your dog. That's your dog. It's counterintuitive to say that's not my dog. That's something totally different without sounding like an absolutely pedantic ass, right? But when you look at it through, if you substitute internet technologies, media, really,
Mhm.
the construction of this reel, I think, becomes much more clear.
Well, I mean, I think it might be profit because this is our charge in this episode. We're thinking about what these arguments about photography 50 years ago, how they might help us, how they illuminate how they might illuminate our understanding of the contemporary internet media digital landscape. So is this fair? One of the things so everything that Sontag, we have to square or we have to cube whatever Sontag is talking about in photography to make sense of our to adequately describe or to factor in our current media landscape. And thinking about your dog, the dog picture for a moment, is it fair to say that if the photograph turns the world, the photograph of the dog turns your dog into a photograph,
Hmm.
that what's happened, this is part of the cube, Sontag's argument, cubed or squared effect of the photography argument, that what's happening now is that your photograph of the dog, your dog has become a photograph when you photograph the dog, but that even further, your dog has been further abstracted to become content when it's streamed on.
Yes. In fact, he goes on to say a little bit further talking about a series of different events that are photographed. Um, they are all, so he talks, look at a couple lines here, right? This has an atomizing effect. People and experiences appear discrete, the sort of
Yeah.
thing sizable for
Yeah.
collection in the
Yeah.
miscellany of memory. A little
Yeah.
bit further, he says they are reduced to the status of the event, something that
Right.
is worth seeing, therefore worth
Yeah.
photographing.
That
That
seems to be
this
the Instagram difference.
It
Yeah.
becomes content. So anything photographed, as you just said, becomes content, becomes an event that is separate. It becomes because what do you do when you look at a picture of something? You fill in the narrative around that.
Right.
That becomes a story. That becomes content as opposed that is removed from its actual historical
Right.
moment.
Right. So I'm trying to think of this as a sort of a series of discrete steps. I was sort of clumsily I don't know, conflating them. I'm going to try to separate them, inspired by what you just said. So maybe we can think of this as a series of historical steps. So
Mm-hmm.
the first step of it is that the photograph turns Auntie Lynn. Is that I want to use the name of the aunt that Milne mentions later because I liked it.
I know
Auntie
what you're talking about.
Leone, Aunt Leone, Aunt Leone. Well, I'm sorry I did this now. I'm going to change it to Auntie Lynn. But
Mm-hmm.
so my photograph of Auntie Lynn, and this is the universe, the media universe or landscape that Sontag is describing. My photograph of Auntie Lynn turns Auntie Lynn into a photograph that can be consumed, collected, composed in my memory, and,
Mm-hmm.
and that I can feel that I possess that photograph. Auntie Lynn, I don't really possess, but my photograph of Auntie Lynn, I damn well do possess it, right?
Right.
So, okay, that's one level of abstraction from reality. And in that level of abstraction, I'm kind of the better for it, or I feel that I'm the better for it because uh, the difference between Auntie Lynn and my photograph of Auntie Lynn is I can collect and possess, and I
You
own in a sense.
have that
Yeah, I
photograph.
have it.
That's yours.
It's mine.
She's in your pocket. She's
But
stuck in your
okay,
phone.
so okay, now, and that's where I wanted to go, Michael. So help me with that. Okay, now what happens when I have my photograph of Auntie Lynn and I post it? In a weird way, it's still my possession, even though it's the possession of this larger public. Now I'm thinking aloud here, so tell me if I'm
Mm-hmm.
wrong with this. But I'm trying to think about what is the next step from the process. This is the part of it that Soundtag didn't really live to
Well,
see. So
so
we want to fill it in.
so a number of things can happen, I think, right? Auntie Lynn becomes a part of a larger collection of images of which she has no personal recollection, no personal history. And even if she does, it doesn't matter because this is not the real. This is the alternate real,
Right.
right? And those images come together and form a narrative unto themselves, which is whatever you choose to make it. Okay. Alternately, she becomes a part of a public without actual presence in that public, which is an entirely messed up and weird thing. But she becomes a part of something that
Yeah.
is, in fact, completely separate from
Right.
herself.
Right. Right.
Um,
Right.
and so the
Actually,
narrative,
in both cases, poor Auntie Lynn is alienated from herself. It's no longer about Annie Lynn.
well,
You're
that's to
in
say,
a way
Auntie
in both
Lynn has
cases.
now lost control of
Yeah,
her own
totally. Totally.
narrative.
Yeah. Yeah. This might be a good place, unless you want to add something. This might be a good place to move to the next passage that we wanted to foreground because it brings up the next passage
Yes.
invokes the public. So
Yes.
maybe we should segue there. All right. Later on in Mill's essay, I'm very grateful for this. Thank you, Andrew Milne, for bringing in Soren Kierkegaard, who I never thought of as a media critic. But as it turns out, we've had a lot of episodes about newspapers that we sort of reconsidered, viewed from the perspective of Raymond Williams. I don't know if we've done a Walter Benjamin newspaper episode, but we should one day. But we certainly talked about newspapers in relation to, I think, both McLuhan and Williams.
Hmm. Hmm.
Sontag's, and here we can add the Danish philosopher Soren Kierkegaard to our list. So, reading Mill now. Sontag's complaint about the leveling, quote unquote, effect of media is nothing new. It goes back at least to the Danish philosopher Soren Kierkegaard in the 1840s. At that time, new telegraph networks and faster printing presses meant that each morning more eyes were focused on news about elsewhere. Now, the function or the effect, I suppose, of this news about elsewhere is what Milne goes on to describe in the next two sentences. Kierkegaard thought that as we become more curious about the distant events broadcast and, portrayed in newspapers, our own lives lose intensity. We cease to see ourselves as concrete individuals and become members of that abstraction, the public, whose solitary duty is to be informed. That's an interesting way of thinking about it. That when I become part of the public, my own wants, desires, needs, individual substratum become subordinated to, I have become the subject who wants to be informed. I am the subject who wants to know information.
Whose solitary duty is to be informed, to be conversant with the topics of the
Topics of the
day.
day. Yeah.
To me, and I'm very curious to hear your take on this, but to me,
Mhm.
this again is a question of power and control. The argument, as I understand it, is
Mhm.
when we start to get news from other places further afield, further removed from our immediate orbit, we start to invest ourselves there, which means we sort of divest ourselves a little bit from our immediate realities.
That is exactly the Kierkegaard argument, and according to Mill, I think accurately, that's exactly where Sontag goes with it.
But the problem, and this is where I'm very curious for your take on this.
Mhm.
The problem in there, as I understand this,
Mhm.
excuse me, is that if I have to be conversant with the topics of the day and
Indeed.
knowledgeable of the topics of the day, those topics don't necessarily have any immediate bearing on my reality. So now my attention is being
In fact, they almost certainly
certainly
don't.
don't. Right. And so now I am obligated to pay attention, which is a limited commodity, to things outside of my focus is being diluted essentially. And I think that, my God, if anything in here was going to forecast our reality now,
It's that.
this is it, right? Like, how much time do you spend, you personally, me personally, any of you guys listening, to things that are interesting, that are something we may want to talk about, but are,
That are topics of the day.
yes. So,
And their only virtue really is being the topic of the day. And there's I don't know if Mill meant this, but he probably did. Topic of the day. There's a timestamp to this, right? Is it literally is the topic of the damn day.
so let me ask you a question. We talk about here the real and the not real, right? In theory, if we can all gather around the water cooler and talk about the topics of the day, that brings us together, right?
Indeed.
We
Right.
all have something in common that we can talk about. So we become a more unified, more interested, more informed public. The argument, though, is that that's not real because it's not germane to my particular interest. It's not like there's a
That's
contradiction wrapped up in
There
this.
is. And you're touching on something that I thought we would get to our next and almost final point. Maybe will be our final point. But let me throw it a little bit out here. And in fact, I'm gonna be this is gonna be a dramatic moment here. dear listeners, because I didn't real we had our usual pregame talk, but I didn't tell Dr. Michael Rapucci this part. Um, in rereading Milne's expert summary of Sontag,
Mhm.
I do remember that reading Plato's Cave, which I came to it late. In reading Plato's Cave and reading it seriously, I guess I had read it before, but I didn't really have a context to put it in. This episode, this show helped me put it in a context, and I felt it was a very fresh piece of writing, and I was very much a Sontag stan. I still am, but revisiting Sontag in this argument, I have to say that I felt for the first time that there's a dated aspect. I want to put this out there, and we don't have to talk about it now because I think we're going to talk about it a lot when I read you the next passage. But I just want to throw it out because you were kind of suggesting it. I think there's something I felt for the first time in revisiting Sontag's arguments about photography that I love and still love, and I think is still spot on, all the stuff we've been talking about. Her psychologizing of the relationship, her reading of the psychology of the photograph taker and user, that all is really good. Her arguments about that it's possible for us to live in a world that's almost wholly mediated by photographic images. Obviously, that's a groundbreaker, and that's really, really true. Here's the part of her argument that I think is really dated, and I think there's a real timestamp. Her insistence that there is a real that stands in total opposition to the photographic real. She seems to want against, I'm thinking of this in relation to what you just mentioned, right? The newspaper, that's ersatz real. Following Kierkegaard, Sontag would say, our interest in the topics of the day is ersatz real. Okay, I buy it. I could see that, how it's mediated. I could see even the ways in which that ersatz relationship would qualify as, dare I say it, false consciousness. But here's the part of her argument that I think is a little bit creaky. Can I say it? Creaky, a little bit time stamped. What's her idea of the real? Like, would she say that the real requires a face? You use the water cooler example. This is what set it off, this landmine in my mind. Would Sontag say, you know what? If you're just going online and reading about reviews of Taylor's new album, you're joining in on the topic of the day, but you're at a distance from it. Whereas if you're at the water cooler and Taylor's new album becomes a subject in the classroom,
I
or in the
gotcha.
water cooler, in the workplace, during a work break, that's the real thing. I don't know if Sontag would necessarily say that. And
So,
then I kind of wonder, so what is, Susan, with all due respect, what is your real?
so I get it. And I think that's a really interesting, and I think it's a really good example. Um, I would say that there is still very much a real, but okay, so bottom line, my answer, what would the real be?
Yeah.
Nature, right? This idea that you are,
Even after reading Jonathan Crary, you still feel there's a nature out there that serves as the real.
oh, especially,
That's what Mr.
no,
Crary
that's a
said.
great,
It's burning down. The
but
earth
that's the
is
point.
burning.
That's a great call. He's right. I said it, and Crary's right. It is desperately in need of saving in this way
But it's the
because it
real
is
real.
incredibly threatened in this way.
Yeah.
But there is still that thing. Now, how many of us regularly access the real? You'll notice that a lot of the people who do are evangelical about it. It is the answer to everything because it is the last place,
It's where you got
right?
to go. It's where
That
you got to
that
go.
and the problem is, what do you do now when you there's a God, it was a I think it was a commercial I saw on TV the other day. Um, okay, yeah, it was. And it was a commercial, oddly enough, I think it was for an insurance company, right? And guy standing out in the woods, and he's like, God, I love places like this. This is like the last, you got to get here before everybody else gets here. And then boom, there's some girl with her cell phone videotaping herself saying, "Oh, I'm just out here doing my daily meditation or whatever." Like those places are dying. They're being overrun. But that is the last, I think, space of real, right?
So
Like you
you
go,
have to be alone with nature to have the real? I mean, does
well, I
Sontag
so
feel that? I mean, in which case, isn't that kind of a time? That's another thing I think is a little creaky in all this.
I don't, yeah. So like as you were talking, my thought was, well, like, okay, so if the water cooler is not the real, and it's not just the water cooler itself, it's the conversation that surrounds the water cooler. It is the context of the water cooler in terms of everything else that's going on around it.
Mhm.
So what happens if you just step outside and you're on a city street? Well, that's not the real, right? You are flooded with compositions. You are flooded with the not real. We need a word for the photograph, right? But you're flooded with media. And so
Mhm.
I think that what she's trying to get to, and what I'm trying to get to, and what Jonathan Crary would tell you, you absolutely must save by burning everything down and starting over,
Yeah, yeah,
is
yeah,
is a purely analog moment that is not mediated. And that's the tricky part. So
yeah.
you got to go for it. You can't. It's not accessible.
And for Sontag, it's consciousness. I think you hit on something really important in your example about nature. This idea of the solitude. I think she would feel that solitary contemplation or solitary communion is a kind of prerequisite for the real. That it has something to do with the reflection of the subject upon the image. That's the only way to make the image real, and not an ersatz real. You know what? I think let's go to our last passage.
The last passage is not. It is a continuation of this.
Yeah,
Let's
because it is,
yes,
yeah, yeah. It's not going to be really a transition. It will get us closer to closure, but I think we're going to be able to continue this line of discussion.
yeah.
So I'll read it, Michael. For Plato, here's our glory moment. We're back to Plato and Sontag, and we want to deal with this crucial distinction. And it is very much what we were kind of dancing around in this last discussion thread. All right, I'm reading Mill now. For Plato, reality is a world of abstract ideas hidden behind the facade of sensory experience. His cave dwellers are prisoners, excuse me, prisoners forced to watch, bickering. Oh,
Flickering.
sorry, flickering, evanescent. I have bad lighting here in my house. I'm sorry. Flickering, evanescent images cast on the wall. Knowledge alone can loosen our bonds for Plato, allow us to discover the source of the illusion that we mistake for reality. Sontag's cave is a different proposition. It is the cave of the Cyclops and the Gorgon, where all that moves becomes ossified before that one inframing eye, the one inframing eye of the camera. What Sontag sought, this is her real, right? We're
Mm-hmm.
reading the passage where
Yes.
Milne is describing Sontag's real, which is different from Plato's real. What Sontag sought were not the truths of static facts or abstract ideas, right? But those of lived experience. In the Warren, oh, you know what? Guess what? Mr. Milne is a little bit on my side. Did you know?
Mm-hmm.
In the Warren existentialist jargon, she was after authenticity, immersion in the moment, So long as we do not assume that this means the non-discursive presence advocated by her contemporaries and slogans such as "Be Here Now." Do I have to read? Yeah, I should read the next paragraph and then I'm going to open it up and I guess we can have closing remarks on this
Mm-hmm.
because here's our money. Sontag was interested above all in enriching the sort of stories which we tell about ourselves and others. She was interested in consciousness, but not in the narrow sense of the mind as opposed to the body, but in the novelist sense of the narratives of embodied subjects. Understanding for Sontag is not a matter of taking things at face value, but a matter of interpretation. Quote from Sontag: only that which narrates can make us understand, she writes. I want to go immediately to Dr. Rapici because I know he has a brilliant reading of this particular paragraph. He has already made an observation about this that he needs to share with you, that he's already shared with me.
So, yeah, the thing that strikes me about this, right? So this is juxtaposed with Plato's cave, where we get a version of the real that is not accurate. And the only way that we can understand the real is by coming out of the
Transcending,
cave,
yeah, yeah.
transcending it, learning.
Transcending ideas,
And
learning, education, knowledge, truth.
Sontag's
Yeah,
Sontag's access to the real is a little different. It's through lived experience. It's through interaction. It's through engagement. Um, the note that I made to myself is that all of these terms that
yeah,
Milne is using to describe Sontag's, uh, you know, real. These are very active, and this is very active, engaged
absolutely.
language.
As opposed to the weirdly passive, right? There's a we, you know, in a we talked about the photographer as a manipulator of reality, as trying to engage or enact a power game on reality, trying to literally
Well,
master reality. But weirdly enough, in that there's another side of the photographer that Sontag grasps that they're very passive in the face of the image.
mhm. Well, to use the nature example again, according to this, Sontag's real requires more than just being in nature. You can't just pop a spot on the ground and say, "Here I am, let me meditate and enjoy the quiet." Right? It is about a lived interaction. It is about consciousness. It is about interpretation. It is about producing meaning out of things. It's about being in a moment actively. And the thing that really jumped out at me, and we've talked a lot about the mediated world and the Jonathan Crary 24/7 push and the frenetic pace that the internet has brought upon us, and how meaning is always mediated, right? And so I was thinking about Stiegler's concept of noesis, like how do we have room to think, right? How do we remove ourselves from the not real and access something real? How do we engage and create productive, meaningful thought? Where do we create that space? And so for him, it is to remove yourself from everything. Sontag's is a very different version of this. And there's an interesting tension between the two in terms of she's saying you have to plug in, you have to experience. But the thing that just struck me this time is she says, or he says, understanding for Sontag is not a matter of taking things at face value, but a matter of interpretation. And I have to wonder if that interpretation. So there's a couple things I want to ask you about your take on this. That interpretation requires time. You have to have a body of knowledge to call upon in order to form an interpretation, right? Like you have to connect whatever it is that you are interpreting to something that you previously know so that you can create meaning. Is this working so far here?
Oh,
Right.
yeah.
And so it's like the real requires a prior experience of a real, or at least a reliable, um, sort of terra firma, and then the time to process that. And it's fascinating because we think about the very first thing we talked about here with the photographic image as bestowing power upon the photographer, about making things understandable, about freezing an image so that we do have time to reflect upon
To
it.
reflect on.
It's almost as if the real is somehow, and this again, I think it's not entirely fair to Sontag, because I'm looking at this through a connected, nonstop, instantaneous, networked world
Media
that
world. Yeah,
she
media
was
space.
not dealing with. But it's almost as if access to the real, in some way is requiring what the photograph provides us.
Hmm. So we need photograph to
Well,
give us
I'm
that
wondering now if
real.
you haven't tricked me into switching sides of my argument from just a
Uh-oh.
few moments ago.
Yeah, I mean the last bit there does seem to be a reversal of what I
Yeah, I don't
think
know. I
both
mean,
of
I'm
us have
look.
been
I,
saying.
so again, this is something I'm trying to think through
Yeah, no, but
now.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, but it did. I was surprised by that last move, and I wanted to make sure I understood it. You're thinking that the photograph now might have a
Well,
new heuristic value, and that it might allow us access to
what
the
does the
real world.
photograph do for us? Right? It freezes a moment. It's like writing for Plato. It is the memory for us.
But you're
Right?
talking about, I think we have to clarify this right now. You're talking about the photograph, or you're talking about the photograph online?
Oh,
Is that the distinction you're making?
no, I wasn't making that distinction at all, actually.
But
Um,
maybe that was a distinction you were making. Maybe you were saying I need the photograph in its analog form.
Certainly, but I'm wondering, is there a distinction between that and
Hmm.
the image that you post somewhere that, like, does it matter?
Well, how about let's assume that the analog photograph, let's just let's see if we can make this work with one part of the formula.
No.
Like tell me how the analog photograph, and then we can see whether or not it breaks apart when we think about the digital world or not. But tell me how you were go ahead and finish your thought and tell me how you thought the analog photograph might get us back to the real world.
All right. So,
By telling a story about it, it sounded like that's where
well,
you're going.
so
By
Sontag would argue,
interpreting
right,
it.
that every photograph
Mhm.
is a composition,
Right.
and that composition will tell a story.
Mhm.
Okay, that there's no, I mean, I can't imagine. Tell me if you see this differently. I can't imagine of an image that does not tell a story. It might not necessarily be a story I'm interested in hearing or investigating, but there's always going to be a story there because there's always a composition. They are
Yeah.
read, an image is
Right.
read,
Well,
right?
except for abstract photographs, but most I mean, abstract photographs are, arty photographs. That's not what you're talking about.
No, but I
So
still
I
don't
think
think
you're correcting me.
I still think that in trying to understand an artsy,
You would tell a story. You
you
would
would
have to
you
interpret it.
tell a story.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
so the image of my dog,
Hmm.
I look at it and I see her there and I say, oh, okay. So this was yesterday when she was acting like a knucklehead and doing whatever. And I took this picture because I thought it was funny. That now brings me around to a memory that I have that was a lived experience. Is there a difference? Has relying upon that image tainted or altered my prior experience of the real? Because
It
I've
created a new experience of the real, I think she was saying. And you know what? If I feel that what you're saying, and I think you're right, but for some reason this dissatisfies me about Sontag.
I'm not terribly comfortable with this
But
either.
if I'm trying to unpack what you're saying. I think what you're saying is, yeah, the photograph objectifies reality. I can have a master-slave relation to it, all these things. But if I narrate, if I journal about my photograph, in a way, I kind of turned the photographic image back into real life by creating a new narrative.
Let me
I
ask you.
therefore thereby reconnecting it to her words, lived experience. Is that what you're saying?
Well, maybe. Let me ask you a question, which might clarify everything, or it could throw just a massive monkey wrench into this.
Let's hope the latter. We need monkey wrenches.
Well, I
Yeah.
think it's going that way as I'm thinking through this here. Do we have, like, is the real some sort of objective thing? Because the distinction that seems to be made from the beginning of this on is that the minute you snap a picture,
Mhm.
right, you have created a composition. It is no longer objective. This
You
is now a
created an object.
subjective thing.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if we look at whatever constitutes reality
Mm.
as some sort of objective existence that we're in,
Mm.
that separates it along a very clear line from
Mm.
any sort of composition, right? The minute I start to imbue my reality
Mhm.
with values, this is good, this is bad, this was happy, this was sad, right?
Mm. Mhm.
I feel like I'm about to drive us into a very bad place. But the minute I start to do that, is it still the real, or is it now some narrated, concocted version of this?
Well, I you're convincing me now that Sontag is not really about the real. If her real, as Milne says, is consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
is lived experience,
It's
is our
interpretation, though.
interpretation. Okay.
Yeah.
All of that, there's no real. In all of that.
Because is that
Activities, but it's
is
not real.
is that because every
They're
see, I just did it
activities.
there. Is that because then reality is idiosyncratic, that your reality and my, I mean, this, look, so we've come down, what was the word that Colbert used? Truthiness, right? Is that
Well,
what
she
this
doesn't
is?
believe it. She's not a Platonist, right? And one
Mm-hmm.
of the things that means is that she doesn't believe in an absolute. So I don't think she believes in the real, if by the real. Now I wasn't so sure that's what you meant, but if you do mean, if that is what you're declaring you mean, um, by the real is an absolute truth, then she's not about that. Her real is not that.
No, so what is it? Because that's clear,
It's all
right?
these things. It's all these things. And these seem to be activities that are necessarily going to be temporal, as you were saying. They might produce different results. So, for example, if one creates a narrative from a photograph, I think the implication, rather than, okay, I'm journaling, I'm writing the narrative, I'm interpreting the photograph. I don't think Sontag feels, okay, thank God you started interpreting this photograph. Now we're going to get a truth. I don't think she would ever use the word truthiness, so I'll throw out
No,
Colbert.
no, no, no.
But I no, nor do I think she would say, well, we're interpreting the photograph, so it's the real. It's the solid, static, real. No,
No, but that's not right.
you're engaging it in an activity, and that for her is as close as you're going to get to the real.
See,
But
this
that's
is
not
where,
the real.
no, but see, that's this, we've, I think we've chosen our terms very poorly, for this
Okay, I'm
evening,
sorry.
unfortunately. No, I think I was the first one to do it. Um, so this idea, I guess maybe let me back up and say it this way. If we understand that the photographic image,
Uh,
whether it's an analog image or a digital image, I don't think it matters,
yeah,
right?
I
If the
don't think it does
photographic
either.
image is a construction or composition
Yeah.
that is not reality, that is not that is not real, that is not authentic.
That is not authentic. I like that.
Okay. Then to get to authenticity is
You have to
a
narrate it. You have to interpret it. Yes.
so then what is authentic is still not necessarily real in an absolute sense.
Yeah, that's all I'm saying. I
Okay.
think that's all I'm saying.
Okay.
It's not real in a platonic sense, where we moved really away, really. We've moved away substantially from Plato's
So
understanding of the
so
real,
then what is the value of going to such great lengths?
of partnering with Plato.
No, no, no.
No, of
Of
contact part. And I was thinking
of
that.
parsing out the
Mm,
distinction
mm-hmm,
between the not between the inauthenticity
mm-hmm,
of the photographic image
mm-hmm.
and some version of authenticity which is going to be unique to each person who experiences it.
You know what? You just succinctly described what I feel is a little bit time stamped about this essay. I think you just hit it. She feels that question is a great moment,
Mm-hmm.
that it's really worth describing and parceling out the difference between an inauthentic experience of media created by media
Right.
and personal authenticity in the world. And I don't think, and I seem Milne's phrasing implies that he doesn't necessarily automatically agree either. I don't think that the best way of making sense of our media landscape is by recourse or by parceling out or trying to distinguish between an inauthentic and an authentic relation to reality. So this is one of the things that's given me a big problem with Sontag.
I think that's an interesting thing to, and this is just because our relation to authenticity in
Is
her
it
terms is so
exactly.
okay.
Exactly. Well, go ahead and finish the sentence. But
No,
yeah,
I was
I
gonna
think
say
you're
is
saying
so
exactly what I
well, it
thought.
gets us back to Kierkegaard, right? Is so diluted, is so watered down, it is so incredibly reliant upon so many
Yeah.
disparate,
Yeah.
detached things.
That I don't think we can do this parceling out in this semantic play that she thinks there's a lot of semantic and literally we're talking about narrative interpretation. She still has a lot of faith in the productive aspects of consciousness, and I guess I guess I'm implicitly I guess I guess talking about all these issues now. um um, I guess I have a little bit of what's the word, pessimism about our ability to access the authentic.
Is it pessimism or is it the fact that, as we said earlier, we chose our terms very poorly this evening? Is it perhaps that we simply have to recalibrate um, our vocabulary and our sort of I don't, as you said, if her heyday is the 60s and the 70s, that is not compatible. The language still fits in the sense that we can use
I
these
think her
words.
values are not our values anymore.
Yeah. Okay. So this is an academic intellectual exercise then?
No, 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 no. You know what? I think that there seem to be two parts of the. Okay, I think we're ready for the final
Yeah,
takeaway.
yeah, yeah.
So I'll give you my final takeaway. Um, I think that this last discussion thread, where we're very at odds with ourselves and with Sontag,
Yeah, you're
right?
not kidding, man.
Yeah, this last discussion thread, I think, is illustrative of the ways in which Sontag doesn't provide us with a map for our current digital reality. But I don't want that to be the final note, because I think there is another. I don't think it's merely quote unquote academic. And I don't think that's the only. I think there's reason to do what we did, which is to revisit this article and this set of arguments at the present time, because the idea of media, whether it's the photograph per se or the photograph on your screen, the idea of that, of us having the argument that we have a psychological relationship to it, that the image and our relationship to it can serve to compensate or substitute for a real, whatever that means. And I'll use the word real rather than authentic. For a real, or maybe a social, maybe I won't use that word. Maybe I'll use social. There might be more social ways of interacting with the world, that we are using our mediated relation with the image, that we're using that to substitute for this perhaps more social or sociable relation to the world. I think that's very relevant. And that's part of Sontag too.
Yeah, I don't have a takeaway beyond where I sort of crashed and landed, to be quite honest with you. This is I think that trying to parse out some notion of an authentic experience is still valuable. I think it's still a thing to do. But I think that part of the problem is that it is so intertwined with the social.
Okay.
And everything is
And
now.
she's not. She's thinking of it in an individualist cast,
Well,
right?
it's tricky, right? Though, because it on one hand, it will always necessarily be individual. It will always be unique to the person who is experiencing it. The problem is that I think that the matrix of interpretation, right? Like whatever that sort of process is, I almost use the word algorithmic there, like how it is that we're going to go through and try and get to this understanding of, authenticity is maybe just so exponentially complex that it's the Kierkegaard argument on steroids, right? Like everything has become the water cooler talk. And so if you're looking for a personal authentic,
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Yeah.
there's
Complicated.
necessarily a thing there because we exist. And I think there has to be something authentic at the core of that. But maybe the language is not right for it. I don't know.
That's a good place for us to end.
Well, that was awkward. Okay. Well, Barry, thank you. Thank you. This was an interesting discussion. This is not done in my head yet. I just don't know where to go with it right now.
A good place for us to end it.
Dear listeners, thank you for coming along for the ride. Barry,
Yes,
this was fun. Thank you very much.
It was fun. Take care, Michael.
Have a good one.
Thanks for listening to the Critical Media Studies podcast. To find out more about the show, check out our webpage at criticalmediastudiespodcast.com.